Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Jeremy Birmingham. This is Talking Stuff. I'll be joined momentarily by my co-host, Andrew Ellis, as we dive into all the things about Ohio State football recruiting, including the latest 2025 offensive line offer, a new name to know at the edge/jack position in the class of 2025 inside of Ohio. And we'll take a quick look at some of the key visitors this weekend as the Buckeyes prepare to take on Marshall. Let's get to it. Andrew Ellis joins us. Happy Thursday morning, Andrew. It's nice to be able to record this on the day that we're actually doing it, so we don't have to use weird context all the time. You're like, well, when we recorded this on Wednesday night, or when by the time this airs. So this is recording on Thursday morning. This will be online immediately after it's done, and so I don't imagine a lot is going to change by the time we hit stop recording to finish uploading. So let's just start there. People don't want to hear us talk about things like movies and stuff like that. Apparently they said that they don't like it. They're like, oh, just get right to football. And I want to talk about the new Oreo flavored Coca-Cola Zero. And I don't know that it actually tastes like Oreo. So if you're a Coke Zero guy, like I am, I don't know if Andrew is or not.
Yes.
Have you had this one yet?
No, I saw something on like Facebook or Instagram, and I thought it was a joke. I didn't think it was an actual real thing.
No, it's a real thing.
It
doesn't taste like Oreo, let's be clear, but it's also not bad. It just I don't know what it is, but it's fine. It's whatever. They all pretty much taste the same. What's not the same, Andrew, is offensive line recruiting, because around the country, some teams do it really well, some teams do it not really well. Ohio State, I think, is sort of in the middle of that. I know that will probably draw the ire of folks who want me to say that Ohio State's the worst offensive line recruiting class in the country, but they're not. They have a couple pretty good players committed and still looking for more. Last week, when the Buckeyes were off, Justin Fry was on. He was on the road visiting a number of players. He went down to Georgia and visited with Demola Ejidahun. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce his last name or not. And so if it's not, I'm sorry. I'm trying my best. He is committed to Georgia Tech, and he is a player that Ohio State has been watching for a minute. He's a guy that when the season started, there was a lot of discussion that Georgia was not ready to accept a commitment from him over the summer, and that's why he ended up picking Georgia Tech. 6'6", 280 pounds from Duluth, Georgia. Big kid, big athlete. I'm going to say this, and it's going to make me sound like I'm immediately trying to spin a narrative. But if you watch the film on Demola Ejidahun, I could be convinced that he's like a poor man's David Sanders type of offensive line prospect. Like very raw, but the size and the way that he plays, the physicality, the way he looks on the field is very similar to David Sanders. And so I'm looking at it and I'm like, hey, that I can see why you'd go after that guy. He's a 3-star player across the recruiting platforms, except for Round 3 has him as a like I think the number 72 ranked player in the country. Again, Georgia is also now apparently pushing for Demola Ejidahun. So we'll see if it matters that in June they basically weren't going to say yes to him. I know that I personally would be offended if I was like trying to commit to a school and they were like, nah, you're not good enough. And then 3 months later, like, actually, you are good enough because the rest of our offensive line class isn't going where we want it to go, which is something that Georgia is experiencing right now as well. Ejidahun is going to visit Ohio State. It's not been decided officially yet if it's going to be the Iowa or Nebraska game. I think it's going to probably end up being the Nebraska game. But Andrew, I noticed a comment of yours after this offer was posted that you said something like, I'll take it. I like it. What makes you like it?
Well, I like it because he has, prototypical offensive tackle size, height, length, all that stuff. I admittedly have not watched his like highlight tape because watching offensive linemen's highlights are really not my thing. But they obviously need tackles. We've been talking for the last few months, other than David Sanders, there's just nobody out there that we've really been talking about. So if you can get this guy who looks the part, even if it's going to take a couple years, then I am 100% on board with it. Now, I will say, I really wish that Georgia was not pushing, because I feel the fan in me. I feel like I've seen this movie before and I know how it ends, but I would love to be wrong.
Yeah, I'm interested in how this unfolds because, again, you always have to take things you hear in the recruiting world with a grain of salt. I've heard that Demola Ajitahun is not like a huge fan of some elements of the Georgia coaching staff and the way that they approach things. I've never spoken to this kid. I've tried. He hasn't responded to a message yet. But things I've heard around him is that he's not a huge fan of the way that some things have gone with Georgia. That probably means nothing. And I'm stuck thinking about former Ohio State commitment Jante Gilbert, who in the early parts of his recruitment, when he was committed to Ohio State, he told me pretty directly that his family was turned off by some things that Georgia had done, and he was not into their approach and their style and their way of recruiting him at all. And that there's nothing that would happen that would make him end up at Georgia. And that's where he's now committed to a year later. So I do think that Georgia has a way of smoothing things over when perhaps Georgia's interesting because unlike Ohio State that doesn't offer a lot of kids in the state until you're absolutely ready to take them, Georgia, because the state of Georgia is so full of talent, they offer a ton of kids in Georgia and then just ghost them if they decide they don't like them. And then because they know that they are able to come back around and get the guy at the end if they want him, generally speaking. So Ohio State obviously made a really big push for Roswell offensive lineman Joshua Petty, who's now committed to Georgia Tech. He's a player that Georgia didn't really recruit either. So now we're seeing Georgia going after Ajitahun. We'll see if it matters. I think that what Ohio State has to really aim for here is a situation that's similar to Gabe Van Sickle's recruitment from a year ago, which is get him on campus quickly after the offer, and then maybe you bring him back. This was probably going to be different because I think the first visit for Ajitahun will be an official visit, and then maybe you can bring him back for a second visit because I think that's what they're going to need, 2 visits here, in my opinion. So if you can get him up for an official against Iowa on October 5th, then you have the Nebraska game, which is a marquee game later in the year at this point, which is going to be probably a top 15 matchup, provided that the Cornhuskers win on Friday night. And then you have the Michigan game. So you could still get 2 trips out of this kid before signing day happens. And if that happens, I think Ohio State will win the fight. If they only get him up once and it's just an official visit, I wouldn't feel confident at that point. But it is a reminder that there are a ton of really good football players around the country that are being evaluated and that Ohio State is waiting to see some senior film from. And this kid's tape is really good. And that's the facts. Big facts, homie.
I mean, it's worth remembering that Georgia was not recruiting Gabe Van Sickle, who's not from Georgia. So I get what you're saying there. I do understand that, but it's just hard for me to be optimistic. Maybe the family is really big about safe driving practices or something like that. And Georgia's had some issues there. So maybe that's a big deal to them. I don't know. That'd be great.
I mean, you certainly hope they're interested in safe driving practices. That's the hope. But obviously Georgia was not involved with Gabe Van Sickle. My point, Andrew, Mr. Negative Nelly, Mr. I'm so salty Thursday, is that the approach from Ohio State has to be the same. How you go from haven't been recruiting you to evaluating and offered you to committed. That's how I think this is going to need to go. Obviously a little bit more difficult for a kid from Georgia as opposed to Michigan. So because Michigan was not recruiting Gabe Van Sickle. Had they been recruiting Gabe Van Sickle, maybe that would be different. But now he's in Columbus, and apparently the coaches are really fond of him. So I've heard a lot of similar things about Gabe Van Sickle this early part of his career that I heard about Austin Sarabeld a year ago. So it's positive. You know what's also positive? Recruiting 5-stars like Naeem Offord. Here's a question. Pop quiz, hot shot. Would you rather have 5-star players committed from Alabama who are visiting other schools, or would you rather that player not be committed and say still visiting the same three schools. What's better? Is it better to be committed in visiting Ohio State, Auburn, and Oregon, or uncommitted visiting Ohio State, Auburn, and Oregon?
I will have to side with the committed option in that scenario.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we're going to beat this drum over and over again when we talk about Neem Offord because, well, there's not a lot else to talk about. Ohio State has 26 commitments in the class of 2025. They're the number one class in the country. This seems to be the one recruitment where there's a little bit of drama. I guess on the periphery, there's a little bit with TJ Alford, which we'll talk about in a minute, but there's not a lot of theatrics in this class for Ohio State. And Neem Offord, went and visited Auburn last weekend when they embarrassed themselves against Cal, who, Cal looks like they're playing pretty good football. Justin Wilcox has done a nice job there. But regardless, if you're Auburn and you're talking about, bringing back the pride of the Tigers and getting back to the level they were at one time 15 years ago, I guess twice. They played in 2 national championship games, right? They played in 2.
Yes.
Under Gus Malzahn. Either way, like you can't lose to Cal if you're doing that, if you're talking about that, especially at home. But they did. And the initial response from people is, oh, well, Neem Offord's not going to be interested in Auburn if they lost to Cal. And I don't know that that's true. I wish it was true. But he's obviously going to get back there again at some point this year. The annoying thing for me, if I'm an Ohio State fan or an Ohio State coach, is that like the Oregon game is locked in and scheduled, right, for October 12th. He's going to that. He's already been to Auburn once. There's talk about him going back there for another game or two. But yet he hasn't officially locked in which Ohio State game he's visiting for. And that's annoying to me. Like the priority probably should be, I know exactly what Ohio State game I'm going to, and I'll figure out the rest. But that does not seem to be the case. Some of it is based on the time of the game. The Ohio State-Oregon game, for example, on October 12th has already been announced as a 4 p.m. local start. So it's a 7 o'clock, so it's easier to travel. Devin Sanchez, for example, was supposed to be visiting Ohio State this weekend for the Marshall game, but is not because it's a noon game and cannot get into town fast enough to do it. So like the Buckeyes are, as per usual, being hampered quite a bit by big noon kickoff and the stupid time of those games. And since the Iowa game does not have an official kickoff time yet, I guess I can understand maybe why you haven't concreted those plans. And I apologize if you hear any sort of outside noise. My neighbors across the street are having their driveway re-blacktopped or something. This is like the 4th time they've had this done this summer, and yet today it's happening and it's very loud. I can hear it through my AirPods. I'm not sure if you can hear it. Andrew, can you hear it?
No, I can't hear it, but
okay, good. Then I won't mention it again.
Yeah.
Forget I said anything.
Good for your neighbors, though. Yeah.
Yeah, forget I said anything if nobody else can hear it. This just sounds like me being a crybaby. Handicap the race here for me, Andrew. How do you feel about it as the voice of the fan? How do you feel about Neem Offord today, September 19th?
I feel okay. Like heading into every week, it seems like I just expect to see some piece of news about him getting back to Auburn this weekend or traveling to Oregon this weekend or whatever. And that's just going to be the ride that we're going to be on for the next few months. I do like that Auburn is not having I know we're still early, but not looking terribly great this season. So I feel like that's a good thing. I'm sure they're going to lose several more games given their schedule. But I mean, you're just going to have to suck it up and just accept the fact that this kid's going to take countless visits. I know Auburn and Oregon are the teams that are mentioned, but I mean, would it really shock anybody if Alabama resurfaces again as a major threat, or LSU or any of those schools? I wouldn't be shocked. But I feel better today than I did maybe 2 weeks ago about him sticking it out with Ohio State.
I think there's a couple things in play here that are always worth mentioning. Number one, I really do think in old football recruiting, so by old I mean 3-4 years ago, I don't think that there would be any concern here at all, to be honest. I think Ohio State would be locked in, but we live in a different timeline now where other things are in play. I think Neem Offord and his family really like Ohio State and are in a position where they would feel like they were doing themselves a disservice if they didn't explore a bunch of options, because there are reasons to do so. Beyond that, however, like we're going to see, and we did see this with the Jeremiah Smith recruitment, the Auburn media, and in some ways the Oregon media, but mostly the Auburn media, is 100% going to be talking about Naeem Offord every single day in some way, shape, or form. They are being, I have no doubt, directed to do so or if not directly directed, they are being, it is being suggested to them that it would be helpful to do so. Every time that these articles get written about, Naeem Offord, how close is he to flip? How close is he to flip? It ends up creating a conversation between Naeem Offord and his family and the Ohio State coaching staff. And every time that conversation happens, there becomes an opportunity or a narrative that, maybe someone's not being honest. Maybe someone's doing something behind our back. Maybe someone's being shady. Maybe these guys aren't actually going to let me handle the recruiting process the way I want. So like what you're trying to create is a division between Ohio State and Naeem Offord and his family. And you can just do that by constantly talking about him. You can do that by constantly creating the narrative that he's actually he's really just waiting for the moment to decommit. He's just trying to figure out how to do it, which is what we heard about Jeremiah Smith over and over and over. I don't know that that's true at all. If it were true, I don't think we would see Naeem Offord and his family working so hard to make sure that they got back to Ohio State this season, because they could very easily say, well, hey, you know what? Sorry, we just can't make it up there. That trip from Birmingham, Alabama to Columbus is not, it's not really convenient to make during the season. And we'll see you guys at the end of the year. Like, they could make excuses. All that being said, Andrew is someone who just recently bought a house. I'm sure you're familiar with the expression best and final, the best and final offer. We haven't seen the best and final offer from Oregon when it comes to NIL. We haven't seen the best and final offer from Auburn when it comes to NIL. We haven't, Ohio State isn't entirely aware exactly what they would have to match in order to win this at the end. So like the story is not anywhere close to written, but it's being written about every single day by people who are benefiting by creating drama. So it's kind of fun.
I think if other schools or even other media members are putting troubling thoughts into his head or his family's head, that they have enough trust and confidence in Tim Walton that they're just, calling him and he's kind of just putting an end to any of those worries right away. At least I like to think that. I've also noticed the Auburn side has written approximately like 6,000 articles about Deuce Knight over the last month and him flipping from Notre Dame. And I don't know what's going on there. That hasn't happened yet either. So maybe there is just like some big push from the school, from the program to have all this content put out there. It definitely seemed like that was happening with Jeremiah Smith, as you alluded to.
Yeah. And the reality, everyone knows Ohio State's going to generate clicks. Everyone knows. So if you write about it, not only are you getting the Auburn fans lathered up and frothing, you're also getting the Ohio State fan base to react. So, I mean, there's a lot of reasons people do it, obviously, but Ohio State, from their perspective, like if you look at what they've done in response to it, there's been zero panic by the Buckeyes to like offer other players or immediately get other cornerbacks up and visited. Like, so there's a lot of mixed signals here. Now, I know Ohio State has other cornerbacks on their big board that they're still evaluating, but you haven't seen a rash of offers go out. You haven't seen them get into contact with a lot of guys. You haven't seen them like make an overture toward players committed elsewhere. So like from Tim Walton's perspective, it seems like he's still fairly comfortable where things are. But again, when those best and finals start to come down in the next 6 weeks, we'll see what happens. The reality from an Ohio State vantage point and from the way that other schools are approaching this is that they're going to look at Ohio State and they're going to say, well, look, the Buckeyes are clearly willing to do whatever it takes to keep Devin Sanchez. Are they not willing to do that for you? And that's how they'll attempt to create a divide between the Offord family and the Buckeyes. But again, Ohio State has not made a rash of responses and has not gone out and offered a bunch of dudes otherwise. So I think that they still feel pretty okay. But outside looking in and just looking at the actions, it's hard for Ohio State fans to feel confident, I would think, based on what we've seen in the last couple of years.
Right. Let me ask you a quick question about that. So I was always a big fan of that Mark Zachary kid, that cornerback from Indianapolis, committed to Notre Dame. I think Ohio State was one of the early favorites. I don't know if it was the dream school or what it was, but obviously things didn't work out. And then, Notre Dame lost at home to Northern Illinois. That was a problem for them. Do you think if Ohio State were to maybe bring him in for a visit at some point, do you think that's like a sign about how they feel about Name Offord, or do you think maybe they just simply want to bring him in for that cornerback 3 role? Because if that kid's your cornerback 3, then you have just a plus phenomenal class at the position.
Yeah, I mean, they still want a third corner in this class. So, but they are. Here's the weird little secret. Like, everyone in the last 10 months has talked about Ohio State on the NIL front and how much money the Buckeyes are spending. Like, Notre Dame is pretty well off when it comes to NIL, like way better than people would think based on the pious attitude of most Notre Dame fans. But they're pretty good. Notre Dame, the number that I heard in respect to Mark Zachary and what he's commanding on the NIL front and was asking for, is significantly more than Ohio State believed he was worth. I would assume that Notre Dame has it lined up to give him that amount. And as long as that's the decision, that's just not going to happen. So the Buckeyes are, we can say a lot of things about it. We can talk in a number of different directions about whether it's right or wrong, but Ohio State stands pretty firm on their evaluations and what they believe a player is worth paying. And what it would mean if they overpaid for someone and they have their number and they're not going to go above it. So say what you want. I mean, again, they're the number 1 class in the country, but that is what other schools are going to do for Na'im Offord and TJ Alford, who visited Florida State for his official visit there this past weekend. Florida State's been the one, the kind of the hip school to talk about and say, oh, well, this is actually the school to worry about, not Miami. BS. Like, I don't buy that at all. I just never have. It feels like Florida State has a lot of momentum heading into the season. They're a team that everyone talks about. They got a lot of swag. They spend a lot of money, and then they're now 0-3. And I now there's questions about where you go as a program. So it's still Miami that I'm worried about when it comes to CJ Alford. He already took its official visit with the Hurricanes over the summer, right? So, like, am I right or wrong about that? I can't remember.
I think you're right. I can check. But I will say on that, you're one of the only people that I've heard or read or talked to who seems to think Miami is the biggest threat there. Like, I heard Florida for a while, and then I saw some people saying Florida State. I wish it were one of those other 2 schools because they're both absolutely terrible this season, and Miami is pretty damn good. But I don't know. I thought he made an official, but I could be wrong.
He took his official visit to Miami in June.
Yeah, he did.
So, that, again, that means nothing. It's not like unofficial visits aren't essentially being paid for these days anyway by schools. Easier said than done at Ohio State. But for Miami, which is only like a 30-minute drive for him anyway, it's not like he has to do a bunch of crazy stuff. The relationship, the desire in like his father and people around him has always been Miami. That's been the one that people have always been worried about. Again, similar to what's going on with Na'im Offord and how Ohio State responds in the situation. Like, we have not seen James Laurinaitis go out and make a bunch of offers to other players or host other 2025 linebackers in the event that something happens. Like, we just have not seen that occur. The Buckeyes have, a player like Paul Nelson in the state, who I've talked about before, who at Cincinnati, Princeton, committed to Indiana, like a really good player, very similar body style and likely a similar player down the road to TJ Alford, I think. But like, TJ Alford has continued to do and say everything right. He said months ago he was going to take these visits. He's done it. I don't know. I'm not sure that you go to Florida State, you go to Tallahassee, and you watch them just lay a complete egg against Memphis and be like, oh, that's where I want to be. Like, I just don't see it. Miami, there's some juice with the Hurricanes right now, and they are going to push the envelope in a number of ways and live in the gray area of where Connor Stallions and Jim Harbaugh live. And as long as he's not signed somewhere, like that's always going to be my biggest concern. So is it time to worry about him in your mind?
No, not really. But like I said, I would much rather it be Florida State or Florida as the prime competition here. Miami's pretty good, so and we know how Miami handles recruitments. So I'm not like terribly worried, but I wish it was one of those other schools. I did see after the Florida State loss to Memphis, one of the Florida State media members like interviews him after the game, after you're coming off this just horrendous loss. And he only had like glowing things to say about the program. So it was just like a stark reminder to me that these kids will say anything, to the reporters if they're representing certain schools at certain times.
And it's also totally creepy that these schools allow their players to be interviewed on official visits, like on campus, when they walk out of the building. It's very bizarre. I don't understand it. I don't know, man. Like, I know I'm getting old, and I know that there's times when I feel like I'm with this new generation of football recruiting is maybe like, it doesn't make me feel good like it used to. Like it felt like it was a job where you were doing something that people really enjoy. And I don't know that people actually enjoy this anymore, to be honest, because people are so just angsty about everything. Maybe it's just because people are angsty about everything and they're actually just angsty about recruiting because they're just angsty about everything else. But he's done and said everything right. But like, I would still just prefer that the guy who told everyone 16 months ago that Ohio State was the place he wanted to be, followed through, committed to Ohio State. Like at some point I would just like him to say, you know what, I'm done with this. I'm committed to Ohio State. I'm going to Ohio State. I don't need to keep doing this. Like the unsaid things don't need to be said. You know what I mean? Like if James Laurinaitis left Ohio State for some reason, or if Ryan Day decided to leave Ohio State, then fine, go ahead and have backup plans and have them ready. But like, you just don't need to keep doing it all the time. Like you just don't need to keep doing it because you've seen everything. You've seen everything you could possibly see over the last 3 years. What else are you going to accomplish on these visits? And the dirty answer, and the answer that now we've just sort of accepted as reality in college football, is the one thing you're getting out of these visits is just more money. And that kind of sucks. Because you're the Ohio State staff, and your job is to build a relationship that you think is going to be meaningful and lasting. And then it's like, it just always feels like it's being built on sand and shifting sands. And I don't think that you could possibly ever feel good about these things again. Like you can say, well, everything feels okay, but like under it all, you're sitting there going, man, I would really prefer if this kid just stopped going and visiting these other schools.
Yeah. I mean, if I were in that situation and I was getting some stacks to take a trip to FSU, that would be the lone reason I would go there. I don't think anybody is going there to see DJU live in the flesh, because that's not been pretty.
No, I can, and I get it. That's what makes this the dichotomy of man here. Like, you are stuck having to recognize that on one hand, this is not good for anybody, but on B, like, it's pretty good for the player and his family. So I don't know. It doesn't feel good. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back and talk about some Marshall visitors as the Buckeyes return home this Saturday at noon on Fox. Big noon kickoff. Ohio State versus Marshall. Everyone's national game of the week, as it were. Why? I don't know. I'd prefer this be a night game. I just prefer night games in Ohio Stadium in September, just for a number of reasons, mostly so I don't have to watch at noon.
Even against Marshall?
Yeah, I just think that the fans can't get up for a noon game against Marshall, and that is annoying to me. Anyway, but we're going to talk about the visitors when we come right back on Talking Stuff. We're back on Talking Stuff, the Ohio State recruiting podcast on the podcast. I'm Jeremy Birmingham. That is Andrew Ellis. Ohio State returns to Ohio Stadium, as mentioned, Saturday noon, Fox, Marshall, the Marshall Plan, the Thundering Herd, the green and white. It's been 20 years since Ohio State played Marshall, I think. And that was the day that Mike Nugent had to kick like a game-winning 50-some-yard field goal to beat the Thundering Herd. If that happens on Saturday, none of these visitors will matter because most of them probably won't make it out of the stadium alive because Ohio State fans will burn the place to the ground because we live in a very rational time. Andrew, do you see the visitors list in front of you? For those of you just listening to this, we'll run it down one by one. But for those watching on YouTube, you get the privilege of seeing these names before we say them, which has to feel pretty good for you. And aren't you glad you learned to read when you were 6? This is not a list that you're going to look at, Andrew, and be like, oh, hell yeah, that's exactly who I want to see. But there's some interesting things happening here. We'll start with Chaz Coleman. Warren G. Harding High School up in Northeast Ohio, Warren, Ohio, the alma mater of former Ohio State great Maurice Clarett. It's been a while since the Buckeyes have tapped into Warren G. Harding up there. And I think it's interesting that James Laurinaitis calls his position group the Regulators. And now we're talking about a guy from Warren G. who could potentially be a part-time regulator. So 6'5", 220 pounds, defensive end, linebacker type. He also plays some offense at tight end for Warren G. Harding. There's been discussion over the last few months about would Ohio State try and replace Justin Hill's position in their recruiting class. And there had not been a real push to do that right away, but I think if there's a guy who could be that guy, it's probably Chaz Coleman. He's picked up an offer from Penn State on Thursday morning. He's got West Virginia. He's got Iowa. Like, this is a guy that people are starting to pay attention to. Maybe not Iowa. I think that's CJ Santa that I'm talking about that's got the Iowa offer, but there's a lot of things happening here. But Chaz Coleman, you can see that there's something there. The question for Ohio State is the same as it was with Justin Hill. How do you recruit a guy like this? Because A, he's not a true defensive end. B, he's not a true linebacker. C, Ohio State doesn't play the jack position. D, Jim Knowles, who wants the jack position, doesn't seem to do a whole lot when it comes to recruiting. And B, E, around E or F?
You're on E.
E, Larry Johnson, if a kid isn't a true defensive end, doesn't always seem entirely interested in helping recruit if a guy's not going to be in his room full time. So F yourself if you're Ohio State, because what are you going to do when you don't know how to recruit a kid? So it's a young player in Ohio who is starting to emerge. Senior year, senior film's really good. People are pushing for him. Again, this is, to me, like, this is the type of dude that if he ends up at Penn State is going to end up just annoying the hell out of you 3 years from now. So you have to find a way to get him in this class. You want a jack. You are telling recruits you are going to start playing the jack next year because the defensive end situation changes considerably. I don't know. I say offer this kid this weekend and go get him.
Yeah, I can definitely get on board with it. I will say I tried to watch his highlights, and I don't know if I was watching sophomore year or what, but he was like almost exclusively at quarterback. And, you know, just the lay person, I watched it and I just saw an athlete. So I'm totally fine with that. He has the size to I would say he has the size to play that jack position, but who the hell knows since we never really actually see it deployed. I will say, like, all those A through F reasons you listed with the jack stuff, in this case, you know, this is a kid that does not have Alabama coming after him like, you know, like Justin Hill did. Yeah, yet, you know, I can't imagine that they would, given that they have Justin Hill and a couple others for that role. But if this is the kind of kid you take a shot on as kind of a project type to play a position that you're allegedly going to be using at some point, and I don't know if either of us can sit here right now and say we actually do believe that, but I would not be disappointed at all if come Monday or Tuesday, if Chaz Coleman has an Ohio State offer.
See, I do believe that they're going to use that position in the future because I think that, and now we're going to dive off of recruiting and get into coaching psyche. I believe Ryan Day and this continued evolution of him as a head coach is going to require it. I believe that he is going to, I feel like every week he seems more and more confident and competent and willing to step up and say, this is my program. This is how it needs to be. And I think you're going to see him be more demonstrative about demanding that in the future because Ohio State's paying Jim Knowles a lot of money. to do what Jim Knowles does for this defense. And in the future, and I can even buy the argument now in the year 2024 why they're not doing it, because you have 5 defensive ends that are really good, and so putting CJ Hicks out there or Mitchell Melton out there in a stand-up role means you're taking Jack Sawyer or JT Tuimoloau off the field in key moments, and I don't think that's smart. So I can buy the argument now. That argument holds no water in 4 months. And Ohio State is going to, whether they win the national championship or lose to Michigan and don't make the Big Ten title game, like next year's roster is going to be completely different, and everything is going to change. So next year, in no matter which way you slice it, is going to be a bit of a, I'm never going to say a rebuild year, but it's going to be a re-identify yourself type of year for the defense. So I feel like you are in a position where you can get creative and do different things next year because the personnel is going to be so considerably different. So a guy like Chaz Coleman, to me, again, 6'5", 225 pounds. I've seen a lot of the quarterback stuff, but I see him also lined up at linebacker, defensive end. The guy's all over the place. And he is just a big fluid athlete, and you need guys like that. The prime example of why you need guys like that, to me, is right now wearing number 20 on the Ohio State defense. So Arvell Reese was not a player in high school that was always jumping off the film at you. He was a player that you weren't sure from a position standpoint where he was going to end up. He was 6'3.5", 6'4", 225, 230 pounds. He'd show up at camp and you'd wonder if he was going to end up being a 265 pound kid or a 215 pound kid. You didn't really know. But you took him, and now like he's a player that everyone in Ohio State's fan base is clamoring for more of, because you get a big athlete like that, and in the world of positionless football, that you find a way to use him. And that's why I think you need to offer Chaz Coleman this weekend, and make sure Penn State, who does a really good job recruiting, like doesn't get their claws in too deep and convince him that, oh, we want you more than they do, or any of that dumb stuff that ends up happening. So that's how I feel. How do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you on that. I don't want to go too far into the, in the weeds about the Jack thing, but last thing I'll say is that the Ohio State's recruiting situation better than anybody. And I think you mentioned them having 4 to 5 good defensive ends right now. I mean, looking at their recruiting classes moving forward, when aren't they going to have 4 to 5 good defensive ends? Like, I know they're not going to have JT and Jack next season, but I don't know. I'm still putting that in the believe it when I see it category.
Yeah, but you know as well as anyone that we've talked for the last 2 years about the lack of elite defensive ends that are in the program in the freshman and sophomore class. So, you have a potential for a guy like Edric Houston to be really good, but there's a gap. There's certainly a gap between Caden Curry and Kenyatta Jackson going into their 4th year, and then you have Edric Houston, and then who else? So you have to try to convince Mitchell Melton to return for another year. The transfer portal is a thing. Obviously, you can go out and try to find someone there, but there's nobody you pencil on the roster and be like, okay, well, now we know who the next guy is. Like and even this past offseason, there was so much concern and questions and hand wringing about Kenyatta Jackson and if he was going to stick around. If we go through this season and he still only plays, a handful of snaps a game, regardless of whether or not he's going to be in a position to be the starter full time next year, he may decide, hey, this isn't it for me, and there's so many things that can happen between now and then. But I know the Ohio State philosophy is we want to use this position. And so if Ryan Day continues to assert himself more thoroughly throughout his program, I think we'll see it change. We could talk all day about this, but we won't. Sincere Johnson, speaking of big linebacker types who you don't know about what they're going to be in college, like Arvell Reese, Sincere Johnson took over for Arvell in the middle of the Glenville Tarbloodder defense. And he camped at Ohio State this summer. He checked in at like 6'3", 236, 237. And there was definitely some concern that he was going to grow himself out of being a linebacker. That has seemingly solved itself. He's played extremely well this year for Glenville. He's a player that a lot of Ohio State fans are waiting for an offer to come out for. I think that happens this weekend because his junior film has been excellent. And I think, people who are looking for the next Glenville guy, we found him. And Sincere Johnson, I think, will get offered this weekend.
Yeah. You know me, like I'm always looking at Glenville guys. So I actually forgot that he had not been offered. And then earlier or yesterday, actually, I checked his offer sheet, which is pretty impressive. I mean, Notre Dame doesn't seem like a program that would offer a bunch of Glenville guys. I don't know. That's just, maybe I'm wrong on that, but Notre Dame.
It's Marcus Freeman trying to get into Ohio and doing the things that he knows win in Ohio from working and saying, and trying to drive that wedge or add a chip on the shoulder of someone saying, "Oh, Ohio State didn't offer you till 6 months after Notre Dame did." Just so you know, that's all that is.
Oh, well, he should focus on beating MAC schools probably, but Florida State's offered. But yeah, I forgot that Ohio State had not offered, so I would be extremely pleased if that changes this weekend.
I'm pretty sure it will. And when it does, I don't think we'll see Sincere Johnson immediately jump into class or anything like that because it's not really the Glenville way. But the Buckeyes will certainly then become the full-on favorite to land him. He's got 18 offers: Florida State, Cincinnati, Louisville, Michigan State, Missouri, Notre Dame, as you mentioned, Wisconsin. Like, there's a lot of really good football linebacker schools who have offered him. And Ohio State, I think, is going to join that list this weekend. 6'3", 225 at Glenville. He's what you want at linebacker. And what Ohio State has lacked in the last handful of years is just that enforcer in the middle, and that is what he is. Another linebacker in the state that is really interesting to me is CJ Santa at Olentangy, and he's not a guy we've talked about here before. I wrote about him a little bit on Wednesday, but he's definitely a player to know. Again, 6'3", 225. He's got offers from only a handful of schools, but Iowa's one. West Virginia's one. Like, he's starting to pick up some of those. To me, it's the same thing with Leroy Roker last year. Like, if Iowa has offered a player at linebacker or defensive back, I want that player. Like, because they know what they're doing. CJ Santa is a really he's a versatile athlete. He excels in track, throwing the discus, throwing the shot put. He reminds me a little bit, and I'm not asking people to go pull up tape on CJ Santa, Sanna at Olentangy, but have you watched Oregon play this year?
Yeah, I have.
Their middle linebacker who also plays baseball for them.
I heard him talking about him, but I forget his name. I know they got like a dual sport guy there.
His name is like Brian Botcher or something like that. Like, that's who CJ Santa reminds me of when I watch the film. So if he can be that player, I'm all into it. He played mostly tight end heading into this season, and now he's full-time at linebacker. And so you're starting to see the recruiting pick up because people are looking at the size and speed and the instincts and going, "Oh, that's interesting." Did not camp at Ohio State this summer, which to me is always a red flag. I asked him, "Hey, why didn't you camp?" He said, "I couldn't work it into my camp schedule." I'm like, "Well, Ohio State's 8 minutes away from your home. And I'm not sure how you can work that in." But a lot of kids maybe don't feel like they are going to camp at Ohio State because, hey, I'm not getting any offers from anyone else. Why would Ohio State offer? And now all of a sudden he's being invited to come watch a game in Columbus. Said he grew up a big Buckeye fan. Obviously surreal to hear from James Laurinaitis. This might be a kid that is worth watching down the road here. The Buckeyes have already offered Storm Miller in the class of 2026 inside of Ohio. They've already offered Jacoby Clapper, who's more of a safety hybrid type from Cincinnati St. Xavier. I think they're going to offer Sincere Johnson this weekend. And so if I'm looking at a fourth potential linebacker in that class, which I think may be necessary, I think Santa is another guy to watch. And if you could get a 4 linebacker class all from Ohio, well, that'd be pretty special because Ohio linebackers end up being pretty good, generally speaking. Yeah. What's your thought?
No, I got nothing else. I've not followed CJ Sana's recruitment.
You want more stars, admit it.
I admittedly did go to his profile and saw that there were not 4 or 5, but I'm not going to complain about that. No, Sincere Johnson's the big one I'm watching. Just offer him and then let him play the Glenville game and then land him in December of next year, I guess.
Yeah, I just like when there are players who we haven't heard about who become players we hear about. I think back to myself being a younger man growing up in Ohio and how cool it would have been to get those calls from Ohio State, and how life-changing it can be for these kids who, even if Ohio State never offers, like now the West Virginias of the world, the Kentuckys of the world, the Cincinnati's are like, oh crap, he's on Ohio State's radar. We need to pick it up. So like just getting that call and being invited to a game at Ohio State this weekend for CJ Santa is going to change his entire life. And like, that's pretty awesome. Yeah, there's still cool something good out there.
Yeah.
What else is good? Messiah Hampton, a 2026 wide receiver. He's from New York. He camped at Ohio State this summer. Added a Buckeyes offer the day he camped. Was very impressive. Another inside guy, kind of similar to Desai Jones, a wide receiver. I don't know. I mean, Brian Hartline, it seems like he's going to want to take 4 receivers every year. He's offered 17 guys already in the class of 2026. Obviously, you have Chris Henry Jr. committed, and then you have a handful of guys like Messiah Hampton and Jaden Ricketts, et cetera, who are all kind of similar. And I thought Jaden Ricketts would be committed to Ohio State by now, but that has slowed down apparently on his end. He's maybe deciding to take a little bit more time. He could open the door for someone like Messiah Hampton, who loved his visit to Ohio State in the summer. Brian Hartline has shown with the recruitment of the 2025 receiver class, especially Desi Jones, that if he wants a guy and he's offered him, if that kid wants in, he's going to say yes. So we'll see if Messiah Hampton, I'm not going to put him on like commitment watch or anything crazy like that, but I would say that there's at least, this isn't an offer or a visit that's being overlooked by Ohio State. I ask some people every week, like who in your mind, who are the biggest visitors this weekend? And Messiah Hampton was one of the names listed. So that's it worth mentioning. So pay attention to him. 2026, 2027 defensive backs, Amari and Xavier Sabb from New Jersey, Glassboro High School in New Jersey. Their brother, Keon Sabb, was offered by Ohio State in the class of 2022. He ended up picking Michigan and then transferred to Alabama heading into this season. So he's down there now in Tuscaloosa. Really athletic family, really good players. Xavier Sabb, the 2027, is probably the higher ceiling of these players, but Amari Sabb is pretty good in his own right. A little bit smaller, more of an inside defensive back, more of a nickel back. God, nickelback sucked. Amari Sabb, it's funny, I was talking to him on Wednesday, and he mentioned that Ohio State was one of his dream schools, like every kid in the country. And I said, that's kind of wild. Like, why is Ohio State one of your dream schools? And I mean, your brother went to Michigan. And he laughed, and he said that he tried to tell his brother. He said, I tried to tell him, but he wouldn't listen. So like, I don't know what that meant. The guys, they did visit Michigan last week, I think. So it's not like they're eschewing the Wolverines entirely. So anyway, just names to keep an eye on. He said his uncle, who's coming to campus with him this weekend, somehow grew up a big Ohio State fan in New York, and used to like be a big David Boston fan. I'm like, that is the most random crap I've ever heard. So here's a guy who grew up in New York, watching and rooting for Ohio State, who became a big fan of a wide receiver from Humble, Texas. Like, I don't know how. Sports is wild when you really let it, percolate. You're like, and that does not make any sense. But here we are. Just names to watch. There's not a lot. The Buckeyes are pretty much waiting till the Iowa game to bring in a big visitors list. So these first few games in Columbus this year have been a touch underwhelming, but it doesn't mean they're not important for the players that are visiting. And especially, again, this weekend, Chaz Coleman, Sincere Johnson are the ones that I'm really, really watching for potential offers. If Chaz Coleman's offered by Ohio State, it's a sign, I think, that the Buckeyes are still telling someone, we're going to play the Jack. And Andrew doesn't believe it. So Jim Knowles, if you're watching this, his name is Andrew Ellis. He thinks you're a liar.
I would love nothing more than just CJ Hicks Jack in 2025, but my faith in that happening is fairly minimal right now. But what do I know?
Seems like you're a guy who just needs some faith in your life.
That's true.
Anyway, Andrew thinks Jim Knowles is a liar. We'll be right back. We're back. Andrew, have you thought about what you said? Do you feel bad about it?
I don't feel bad about it. I'm standing firm in my beliefs. So that's the final stance for me.
Wow, just calling a grown man a liar. That is unbelievable. All Ohio State, we've talked at length in 4-minute offense stuff over the last couple months on Talking Stuff about the 2026 quarterback recruiting. And this week I had reconnected with Nathan Bernard, 6'6", 230 pounds, junior quarterback at Ashland High School in Ohio. He's a guy that we've talked about for a couple of years, and he told me that Ohio State had begun reaching back out to him as he's got 4 games of junior film under his belt, which is not entirely surprising. That is the way that the Buckeyes would prefer to do things, but the calendar has sped up in such a way that players are getting offered and committing way earlier than they should be. On Tuesday of this week, we were at the Woody Hayes Athletic Center, and I asked Ryan Day about his philosophy when it comes to quarterback recruiting, knowing that in the last, if we go back to 2018, Andrew, let's go back to 2017. They had Danny Clark committed for 3 years and ended up pivoting to Tate Martell late in the cycle. Not that late. It was the summer, so heading into a senior year. So it wasn't as late as some of the others, but they end up having Danny Clark committing for multiple years and then end up signing Tate Martell. 2018, you have Emory Jones committed for 2 years. You end up signing Matthew Baldwin. 2019, you have Dwan Mathis committed for the majority of the cycle. He ends up flipping at the end because you went out and got Justin Fields in the transfer portal. 2020, you have Jack Miller committed for 2.5 years. You end up signing CJ Stroud and Jack Miller, but you went after CJ Stroud in October of his senior year. 2021, you have Kyle McCord, who had been committed for multiple years, end up signing him without incident, but then you add Quinn Ewers late into the 2021 class because Quinn had been the guy in 2022, which then forces you to go out and recruit Devin Brown in the end of November of his senior year. 2023, you struggle to find a quarterback because everyone's looking at the roster with CJ Stroud and Kyle McCord and Quinn Ewers and Jack Miller and saying, I don't want to be a part of that. You end up signing Lincoln Keenholz, but finding him again in November and December of his senior year of high school. 2024 is a year where you have Dylan Raiola committed for 8 months. He flips somewhere else. You get Aaron Noland in the class, and then you luck into Julian Sayin late in the process because he transfers from Alabama. 2025, you have Tavian St. Clair, who's been committed for over a year. Doesn't seem like he's going anywhere. This seems like the one time in the last 9 years where it's actually working out that Ohio State identified a guy early, offered him early, and didn't feel the need to move off of him because he's actually lived up to the hype and the billing. 2026, similar to 2023, it seems like quarterbacks around the country are not interested in coming into the Ohio State room that is going to have potentially Aaron Noland, Devin Brown, Julian Sayin, Lincoln Keenholz, Tavian St. Clair, blah, blah, blah. Understandable. It feels like to me that Ohio State may be getting a little bit of a blessing here because they don't want to offer and recruit players that early at quarterback because of everything that's happened in the last few years. So I asked Ryan Day if his philosophy has shifted, how he's feeling about 2026 quarterback recruiting. This is what he said. We can talk about whether or not it's just word salad afterward.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, right. I can't mention anybody right now. So yeah, I mean, I think that when you know, but we've also been in a situation where recruiting's taken a twist or a turn, and when that does, and you've been invested in somebody, and then it, for whatever reason, it goes another way, you can find yourself in a different spot. So, we feel like, we really want to make sure that we evaluate, as much as we possibly can. When you think about like how late it was in CJ Stroud's, like, we felt great about taking CJ because we saw him play. We felt strong about, Lincoln and Devin. Those guys played late in their season, or, into the recruiting process. So, we, feel good about, the guys that we have committed. We feel good about the room that we have, but we always want to make sure that it's the right fit. And what we can't do is be unsure because it's such a huge decision. So sometimes there's more boxes that need to be checked, and we always want to be thorough in that spot.
Checking boxes is what it's about, really. And with Nathan Bernard and his junior season underway, they are checking some boxes, and he's played really, really well. He has not been asked to come visit, but he's also understanding that this process is slow for the Buckeyes and that maybe they're in a position where they don't feel like they needed to hurry, and it could open a door for him. Missouri is another team that's doing the same thing for Nathan Bernard, and he just seems fine with it. Are you okay with Ohio State taking a B tier offense quarterback every couple of years in order to make sure there's continuity in the room?
Yes, absolutely. Especially like as we sit here right now. I mean, you just went through all the names. They've got a loaded quarterback room. I would say you and I both think they're going to get Brady Edmonds in 2027, California quarterback, who may be one of the best, 4 or 5 players in the country. In this case in particular, I would 100% be on board with them taking a shot on a guy like Nathan Bernard. And I have yet to watch a single highlight tape. I'm just kind of spitballing here, but I'm totally on board with that right now.
Yeah. He's 6'6", he's 230. I think it's actually playing in his favor that Ohio State is working now with Will Howard, who similarly built, that you can actually see, hey, we can do this and this and this with a guy who's got a big arm but can move a little bit. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about 2026 quarterback stuff. I did think it was worth mentioning that the Buckeyes and Nathan Bernard are back in contact. So just something to keep an eye on as he continues to go through his junior year. They're undefeated. He's playing really well. 4-minute offense, Andrew. We're going to wrap this up quickly here with some rapid fire stuff. What else is on your mind as we talk about Ohio State football recruiting and letting you get on with your Thursday?
Really only one thing today. I know we've talked about Turbo Rogers possibly being like the running back 3 in the class. And then you've kind of burst everybody's bubbles on that one a couple weeks ago. The other day, I think it might've been Tuesday or Wednesday, our old friend, I think it was Mick Walker, that put a report out about Ohio State and Marquise Davis, Cleveland Heights, Kentucky commit, remaining in contact. I told you like a year ago that he was my personal favorite for the class. And then obviously Ohio State had a coaching change of the position and things soured. Do you think this is something do you think it's at least worth monitoring, or how serious do you think this is? Or is it too soon to even have any level of excitement about it?
I think it's worth monitoring. I think it's felt fairly clear that at some point Marquise Davis was going to return to Ohio State for another visit, especially as the season went along and he got closer to signing day. Kentucky is a fine program. They seem to be struggling a little bit right now. I don't know if maybe they've peaked, maybe they've hit their ceiling, and players around the country are like, yeah, well, that's as good as they're going to get. That's as good as they're going to get. Marquise is elite. Like, I believe he's an elite player, and Ohio State wants elite players. He's also a guy that's versatile enough to play multiple positions. And I think if a kid like Marquise, and you should put on the tape if you haven't watched him, a 6'1", 200 pounds, he runs nasty. And I think the more you see a guy like Quinshon Judkins in Ohio State's offense, and you listen to the running backs talk about Coach Carlos Lockwood and how they feel about him, I know Marquise Davis loved Tony Alford, and Tony Alford made Marquise Davis a priority for Ohio State. And I know that Bo Jackson and Isaiah West being in this class make you think, hey, it's fine if you don't get this kid. To me, he's one of the best players in the state of Ohio. I have always had him on my personal list of running backs higher than Bo Jackson, just because I'm not sure about Bo's long-term ability to stay healthy, because he struggled to do that in high school. And again, that's an issue he's dealing with right now. He had to come out of last week's game with some injury. I don't think you can ever have enough good, physical, nasty, violent running backs from Ohio on your roster. So if you have one of them in Cleveland, and Cleveland Heights is one of the better programs in the state, a lot of talent, you need to keep recruiting the kid. So Ohio State's continuing to recruit him. I will not be surprised if he ends up taking a visit again to Michigan or Tennessee or someplace else. Do I think he's going to sign with Kentucky? I absolutely do not think he's going to sign with Kentucky. If he does, I'll be more than happy to say I'm wrong, but I just don't see it. That doesn't mean he's going to sign with Ohio State, but this is not a recruitment that Ohio State should have ever been discounted in just because he committed to Kentucky when he did, especially knowing that there was a rebuild in the relationship that was required between Marquise Davis and the Buckeyes. I actually think him committing to Kentucky when he did is something that is a benefit for Ohio State, because it allowed them to rebuild this relationship and work on this relationship under the radar a little bit, and let you just kind of get to know a kid again and let him know your new running backs coach without all the pressure and hype of, oh, is he going to go to Ohio State? Oh, when are you committing? Oh, like, I think it's actually a positive for Ohio State. I would expect to see Marquise at Ohio State for a game. I don't know when. I don't know that it's something he'll announce publicly. I think it's when we'll just see him walk down the tunnel and be like, oh, Marquise Davis is here. That's pretty interesting. But definitely one that's still worth paying attention to. And if I had to like talk about Marquise Davis or Justin Hill or Dorian Brew, like which of those former in-state players who Ohio State had to get is most worth still watching, it's probably Marquise Davis, because I don't think Justin Hill has not been responsive to Ohio State's continued attempts to recruit him, from what I understand. And Dorian Brew with the Oregon. I mean, maybe we'll see if Oregon somehow ponied up and flipped name Offord. Maybe that's a different conversation. But right now, Marquise Davis is good. He's good. And he is exactly the type of running back that would thrive in a system for Carlos Lockwood, because he is a guy who wants to play physical, nasty football. And that's what I like, because I'm from Ohio. And in Ohio, we believe in running backs who want to beat the living crap out of you. That's what Marquise Davis does.
Cool.
So, anything else?
To hear it. Nope. That's all I got.
This has been Talking Stuff. We really do appreciate you watching, listening. Please, if you are watching or listening, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Subscribe on the podcast platforms, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and leave a review. Tell your friends. We do this obviously for free. It's a lot of work and a lot of conversation on Talking Stuff. So that's all. Everyone enjoy the weekend. Remember, if you're at Ohio Stadium on Saturday, be loud. That's how you impact Ohio State. I used to say there's only one way a fan could impact recruiting, and that's by being great at a home game. Now there's two ways. You can donate to the foundation or the 1870 Society, and you can be loud when you're at Ohio Stadium, even if the game is a clunker. And Saturday's game is going to be a clunker. So be loud anyway. Andrew Ellis, thanks for joining us. I'm Jeremy Birmingham. This has been Talking Stuff on the podcast. We'll see you next time.